What a privilege it is to be with you all today. I want to say thank you to Andrew, the whole Petrus team. I had an opportunity to meet Andrew a few years ago, and he did me the great honor of inviting me to be a guest on his podcast. Little did I know that podcast episode was going to go a long way, didn't it, Andrew? And we actually won a Gabriel Award that year for Best Podcast Episode of the Year. You want to know what number 2 was? It was Cardinal Pell, like getting out of prison or something. And I was like, wait, we did pretty good. That was a heck of an episode. But it's been a real privilege getting to meet him and his team, to understand more about what Petrus is and does. And what a great thing that Petrus exists, because I believe that bringing all of these great mission advancement folks together is critical just in general, but maybe particularly so right now. I will confess to you that I have no formal experience in the area of mission development, mission advancement, development, or fundraising, and I'm still noticing that those terms are all used fairly interchangeably. I'm sure that there is a difference, but I don't have much formal experience in that world, although I did spend a career in the secular media industry, as you heard Rosie briefly describe. And in those roles, I led revenue and sales organizations for many years. And so I know a thing or two about the fundamental thing that mission advancement does. And what that means to me is you all go out and help provide the material means to achieve a mission. And that is something I'm very familiar with. So I hope that throughout this talk, even though Andrew asked me to speak specifically about one thing, which hopefully will come through in this presentation, but I do hope that also you understand a little bit of that context of how I'm approaching your world, even though I'm not an expert. I want to tell you a little bit about my story to add some additional context to what you're about to hear from me. And I do want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A, because I find that that's usually the best part of these things. But I'm a revert to the faith. So I was born into a faithful Latino family. Any Latinos in the house? Raise your hand. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, about 6 of them. Now, in a group of 150 people, and you'll find out about this statistically in the U.S., there should be 60 hands going up, okay, if we're being representative of the church. But welcome to all my Latino brothers and sisters who are here. I grew up in a very faithful Latino household. I was brought up in the Catholic faith. I was baptized, received my sacraments. And I was born in Los Angeles, where I live now. My father ended up pursuing a career in banking, and he became the leader of the Latin American and Caribbean division for Bank of America. So even though I was born in LA to Colombian parents, that's my background, very quickly we moved. Went to Mexico City. After Mexico City, we lived in Buenos Aires, where our Holy Father is from. After Buenos Aires, we moved to Caracas in Venezuela. After Venezuela, we moved to the U.S. Virgin Islands in St. Thomas. After that, we moved to Florida, to South Florida, which is basically, northern Havana. Very international destination. And so all throughout that, I got to live and experience the Christian faith, the Catholic faith, and all of those different cultural permutations. And that's good, but there was a downside that I would discover later in life, and that is that I was very much, maybe infected is too strong, but nevertheless, I carried with me a very deeply ingrained sense of cultural Catholicism. What does that mean? Cultural Catholicism means, at least for me in my life, that I was growing up in countries that were Christian, were Catholic, where you would walk into a restaurant and it wasn't uncommon to have a little niche or an altar right next to the cash register or something, where people eating lunch would say grace, where it was common. What are you doing this weekend? Well, after church, I'm going to do this. So it was all in the culture. But the downside of that is that the faith, for me, in a way, just became another element of those cultures. We had music. We had some kind of food, right? In Colombia, we're big on sancocho and arepas and things like that. But if you're from another country, you got your own kind of food. And we also had our faith. And it became one among many of these cultural markers that identified me in that standpoint. And for that reason, it kind of disappeared. That's what I found much later in life. It sort of became wallpaper. It's like, it just is in the room. It wasn't until I moved back to the States. Again, I was born in LA, but didn't come back to the States till I was sort of high school age to South Florida. It wasn't until I came back to the States that I had to select Christianity. I had to raise my hand and say, I am a Christian. And by virtue of that, in a way, stand out. It became something much more intentional. And even though we look at this country now in much of a post-Christian sort of way, and that's true, nevertheless, it was a great blessing for me that in coming back to the U.S., I had to choose to be a Christian, and it's produced, in my life, a tremendous amount of fruit. So in college years, like I've already heard a couple of the speakers talk about, I too sort of faded from the faith. Again, it was just this kind of cultural marker. Even though when I went to school at Florida Atlantic University, I don't know if there's any owls. We actually it's a pretty cool school now, but not when I went there. It stood for, FAU stood for Find Another University. And, but now apparently they're pretty cool. But anyway, I went to FAU and I would find myself constantly in arguments with my very atheist professors about a variety of things. Now, if you would have asked me why I was defending the idea of the right to life or why I was defending a natural understanding of marriage, I wouldn't have had a clue to tell you why I was doing that. I was just thought I like being David in a room of Goliaths. I've always enjoyed that. So I would have probably chalked it up to my own temperament or something along those lines. But the reality was the seeds of my faith were built into that foundation. And even though I was drifting, they were still there. And I found myself in these very interesting conversations. But I faded. It wasn't until I met my now wife, she was completely unchurched. She had no faith background whatsoever. She was baptized by hippies in a bathtub, at least as far as we know. That may have not even happened. So she had no faith. And she had a super strong mystical experience. Her story is amazing. You should hear it on your own. But she had a very strong mystical conversion. And when she was converted, she remembered my mom, her mother-in-law. Because every time we would drive by a Catholic church, she'd say, cross yourself. She'd, Jessica, cross yourself. I was like, why am I crossing myself? Because Jesus is in there. So after she had this mystical encounter and actually met Jesus, she came back home and said, I need to become Catholic. And it was at that moment that I started what became, this is about 15 or so years ago, a very strong reversion to my Catholic faith. And over the course of those many years, and particularly after my ordination, God has really poured out his graces. And if I could describe the last several years for me, it's been the taking of everything I've learned in the secular professional world and putting it to work for the kingdom. Because the reality is, my brothers and sisters, the secular world, I don't care what it is, media, sales, marketing, technology, product, HR, they are way ahead of us. Way ahead of us. And some of those tools can be taken and Christianized and baptized and put to the use of the kingdom of God. And that, I feel, is at least in part the mission that God has for me. So that's a little bit about me. Now, professionally, you heard kind of the summation. I got started in sales selling copy machines. Any copier salesmen, former copier people in the audience? It's actually what's that? All right, very good. Doesn't sound like a good experience. We'll find out about it later. Anyway, it's a great proving ground for sales. That was my first job out of college, was selling office equipment in South Florida, door to door, trying to get people to buy this very inanimate, sort of uninteresting object. But I was really good at it. I was really good at selling stuff. But eventually I wanted to sell something that you couldn't sort of be, touch and feel. I wanted to sell an idea, a concept. And I thought to myself, what's the best combination of selling ideas or sales and ideas? And I thought, well, I know what I'll do. I'll get into the entertainment industry. I'll get into the advertising industry. I'll go sell media. And that's what I did. I moved to Los Angeles, got wrapped up in the internet, which was new at the time. I worked for a company called America Online, later to be known as AOL, that had this crazy idea of making the internet as popular as the telephone. And they did that, at least in part. Then I went to work for the Walt Disney Company, learned all about storytelling, the value of intellectual property, how to productize and package things. This is an area that is particularly important for mission advancement. At Disney, everything is productized for maximum leverage and monetization. So they put things in little categories constantly. Then after that, I got to run Univision, big Spanish language media company called Univision. I got to run their digital group. And then I burned out on the corporate world. I left. I got into the startup scene and helped found and start a number of secular digital media startups in Los Angeles. Learned all about how to raise venture capital and that kind of thing. Not the same as mission advancement by a long shot, but it's all about asking people for major gifts. If that's, in that way, it's very similar. All of these things have been part of my formation, and they've taught me quite a bit. One of the things that they've taught me, which I think is central to why all of you are sitting here, is that in the world of professional things, I've discovered that there's really three basic food groups of people, okay? Now, all of these food groups have a lot in common. They can all be visionary, they can all be entrepreneurs, they can all be strategic. So just because you're in one or the other doesn't mean you can't lead anything, or doesn't mean you don't have a vision or that kind of thing. But it's just my sense of the kind of food groups that folks tend to be in. And that's input, output, and throughput. Those are the three flavors of professional folks that I've run into in my experience, which I've just shared with you. Input people are people, generally speaking, that have a bias to attracting opportunity, to striking partnerships, to encouraging investment, to creating value. And they're very, very oriented to growth. That's sort of their wheelhouse, right? That's their bailiwick. Output people are the builders. They're the ones who develop ideas. They're the ones who build products, who create messages, who refine the concepts. And they're very oriented to feedback, to customer satisfaction. How can I make this better? How can I improve? How can I iterate? And then throughput people are all about the systems, the process. They love implementing things. They love looking at a sea of levers and buttons and dashboards and going, if I press this one, that means 1 million more of X, and getting leverage and creating scale. Now, this is not a perfect model, and you may see in these descriptions, you kind of may reside in one or the other, but at the end of the day, you kind of are either an input, an output, or a throughput sort of person. And my guess is in a room full of mission advancement people, there's a lot of input folks here. Now, that doesn't mean only input folks, but my guess is there's a lot of input folks here. I am an input person, if I look at this on an objective level. And I think this is really important because you are all the ones who are going out there and creating the opportunities that the church, through all of its various apostolates and ministries, needs to carry forward the gospel in all of these different ways. So it's really, really critical because guess what? It's really urgent that we get all this stuff right now. The situation in our country over the last 20 years is fairly dire. And I've heard 1,000 different ways of looking at this scenario, and we never can lose hope because we know at the end victory is ours. However, we have to also approach that collaboration with God in a very objective way, and the statistics are awful right now. These are the last 20 years. In other words, this is in everybody in this room's lifetime, and recent lifetime, I would think, unless we got super young people, but I don't see too many of those. My granddaughter's here, so she would be one who hasn't experienced all this. But aside of that, everybody in this room has experienced this decline in the United States. I'm using here sacramental participation as a gauge, but you can look at a number of different metrics. And the reality is we've got some serious urgency to these efforts that we do out in the world in cooperation with God. And the idea that the clergy are going to handle it, I know you've heard this before, but it's A, not Catholic, okay, that the clergy take care of everything, and B, it's a practical impossibility. I'll use LA as an example. In LA, we have roughly 1,000 priests and 500 deacons, roughly. That's 1,500 clergy for 3.5 million Catholics. And that's not counting the people who are yet to come into the faith. And shouldn't we want that? Shouldn't we want the whole of LA, in this case, to know the beauty and truth of the Catholic faith? We should. So relying on me and 1,499 other guys to go out and carry this message forward doesn't work. We need the laity and we need folks in mission advancement to do that. In short, we need what the gospel talked about last weekend, more laborers for the harvest, and that's what each of you in this room are. So if the church is the bulwark of truth, which is what St. Paul says, the church of the living God, the pillar and bulwark of the truth, then I think mission advancement is the bulwark of the bulwark, okay? Because what is to bulwark? To bulwark is to provide support, to defend, to protect something from harm and adversity. And you saw those stats. We got lots of adversity, okay? Lots of things going on around us. So you all are critical to the church's efforts. And I know you know this, but nevertheless, I thought it important to mention it to you from somebody who's coming into the mission advancement world as an outsider. I just think it's really critical. So today, now, this moment, is really important. Now, I found this image, I thought it was actually kind of cool. Now is a gift, right? This moment that we are all living in is a very important gift. And if not now, when, right? That's the question we have to ask ourselves on a constant basis. And there really only is the present moment. That's where God is. God's not in the past, he's not in the future. And generally speaking, we know that because when we dwell on the past, we get depressed, and when we dwell on the future, we get anxious. So think of those as kind of guardrails to keep us focused on the present, and that's where we are. So in this present moment, we have a very critical opportunity in front of us, as I'm joining you, us in mission advancement work to carry out what the church needs in this time and space. Now, speaking of time, the thing about God's time is it's always perfect. God's time is always perfect. Each one of us is in this room from the beginning of time. God knew that we would be in this room together right now in June of 2023, and it's not by accident. I've often thought about, well, how come we weren't born at a different time and place? We could have been, 9th century Africans. Or we could have been first century Asians. But we are all, by and large, whether you were born here or not, we're Americans living in the 21st century. And that means it's really important for us to understand what Pope Francis talks about, which is smelling like the sheep. Well, who are our sheep? They're not the same sheep in the 9th century in Africa. They're not the same sheep from Asia in the 1st century. They're the sheep of America in the 21st century. And do we really know who our sheep are? And here, sheep I'm using to include not just the people that you serve with your apostolates, with your ministries, but also the people who donate to those ministries and apostolates. They're part of that story. Who are these sheep? So to answer that question, I think we got to look at it in two different ways. The first way is to look at it from a country perspective. The second way is to look at it from a church perspective. So let's look at it from the country standpoint first. There's a lot here, okay? Number one, if we were to look at the U.S. demographics, we'd find very quickly that the fastest growing population in America by a moonshot is the Latino community. It is 62 million people living in the U.S. right now, and that's the ones that we know of. If we include undocumented brothers and sisters, my guess is that figure is probably closer to 80 million. But even at 62 million, that is the second largest Hispanic country in the world. Only Mexico's larger. Mexico has about 120 million people living in it. Number two, the Latino population in the United States. Then after that, Colombia and Argentina and every other, Spanish-speaking country. It's roughly 19% of the population right now, 2 out of 10 people. And it's driving all of our population growth. If you isolate just growth, you find that the Latino population is driving literally all of the country's growth when you compare Latino to non-Latino. And so you see that reflected in these graphs. In states like my own home state, California, 1 out of every 2 births is to a Latina mom. In New York, the same thing. Across the country, it's 1 out of 4. 1 out of 4 births. And then when you roll all of this up in secular terms as economic power, it is a massive marketplace. It's nearly $2 trillion this year that country within a country, nation within a nation, will actually go out into the world and spend, okay? Couple of notes on language preference, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, because we get hung up on this quite a bit, especially in the church. From a language preference standpoint, it's important for us to consider where somebody is born, where somebody's from, in order to better isolate, what language we should use to reach them in. But by and large, what you see is that if they're born here, the preference is to English. If they're born somewhere else, the preference is to Spanish. But here's the real insight. Every Latino in the country, including me, anybody you run into, is going to be, broadly speaking, bilingual on some level. They're all going to be bilingual just on a scale. What's important, or in my opinion, more important, irrespective of language, is culture. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the presentation. If you were to isolate just the bicultural, bilingual, people like me, if you were to isolate just us, and the study that my firm has done has found that among the Latino population, this group, the bilingual, bicultural group, is the most important for missionary and activism type of opportunities. They're the most important. They serve as a kind of bridge between worlds, and they're the ones who want to get most involved. If you just isolate that group, you're talking about 22 million people that has about $700 billion in economic power in the country over the course of a given year. So this is what the sheep look like in the U.S. demographically. Now, let's look at it from a church standpoint. I spent my career, by and large, talking to companies like Nike and Toyota and Target, all these guys, about why they should care about this. And showing them 19% made people's hair light up on fire. They're like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. We've got to develop whole initiatives and hire dozens of people and deploy millions of dollars for this 19%. Well, in the church, it's double that. It's double that. So as urgent as it is from a secular standpoint, it's at least twice as important from a Catholic Church standpoint. There's a few very interesting things when you look at the Latino population from a Catholic perspective. One is that you've got this crazy dynamic that exists simultaneously, and that is that every day more Catholics are Latino, and every day less Latinos are Catholic. How does that work? Because you've got the population growing at the same time that you have defections from the church increasing. So you end up, if you grab 100 Latinos, every day there's going to be one less Catholic. But if you grab 100 Catholics, every day there's going to be one more Latino at the same time. Now, you don't have to be a master statistician or actuarian to map out to the future. And what does this mean? What this means is in the United States, our church every day is getting a little smaller and a little bit more Hispanic every day. Okay, so if we fast forward these current trends, we end up with a small, all-Hispanic church. Who wants that? Nobody, not even the Latinos. And that's not Catholic. Again, universal faith. We should have all cultures represented. But that's the reality of what the statistics actually show. Right now in the United States, 42% of all Catholics are Hispanic. 6 out of 10 Catholics under 18 are Hispanic. 6 out of 10. The stat's actually 61%, roughly, of all Catholics under 18 are Latino. If I walked into Nike or any of these other secular companies and I said, did you know that 60% of your target market is X? And if they didn't know that, if they weren't doing something about that, they'd be fired. People would be fired. People would lose their job. Okay? It doesn't get to this point and then they go, oh, we should do something about it. They've been doing something about it for 2 decades, okay, in the secular world. We're just kind of now getting around to the idea of maybe we should do more than translate the bulletin. We're just getting around to that, okay? But that's the reality. And that moment of inflection on this graph that you see, that little dotted line is where we are today. The moment of total inflection is about 4 years out. 4 years out, when the absolute majority of all Catholics in the U.S. are Latino. 4 years. Okay, so if not now, when? Now, this population is raising their kids, by and large, Catholic, but they're raising them Catholic just like I was. Very culturally Catholic. Why are we going here? Because Grandma says. So we go. And where are we going? We're going to the Spanish Mass. Do I speak Spanish? Sorta. Not that well. Am I texting my friends in Spanish? Am I on Snapchat in Spanish? Nope. But I go to the Spanish liturgy. Why? Because Grandma said so. And I just go there. And Catholics, even though historically, when you look at the Latino population in the U.S., they were broadly Catholic. That was just the reality. Not anymore. You want to know when that changed? 2019. 2019. Now, if you look at the Latino population, not the majority is Catholic. The majority is either something other than Catholic or they're completely unaffiliated. That happened in 2019. So all of this is changing, in some cases, not linearly. It's happening logarithmically. It's like, the little line right here, but we're skipping over the line and going to the next vector. That's happening. So again, the urgency from my standpoint as a business guy who came up in the secular world is pretty high. So from my vantage point, I see Latinos as the biggest unrealized opportunity in the church. That is the sleeping giant. And I was joking with people earlier that I title my talks this way. This is actually an interesting insight. Hopefully you can apply it. I started talking about this stuff in a lot of places like this, and I would title my talks something like, Latinos are a big deal, or whatever. And guess what? There'd be 15 people in the audience, all Hispanic, who've all heard the story. And everybody else at the conference went to some other thing. So I was like, I'm never going to include the word Latino ever again in my talk title. I'm going to call it something like Awakening the Sleeping Giant. And people will show up. And guess what? It worked. So now, in this case, you didn't have a choice because there's only one thing going on. So we're kind of cheating here. But if there was other things happening, you would hopefully still be here. But it's an interesting insight because we have a tendency to do that, right? We have whatever is happening at the parish or in our ministries, and then we've got the Latino version. In the secular world, they tried that too, and it failed miserably. Who of you remembers, Hulu Latino? It was a real thing. Who of you remembers that? They pumped a bunch of money into it, realized it failed, and then quickly shelved it. Same thing with Yahoo Latino and all these Latino flavors, because I'm not going to go there. I am Hispanic, but I consume all the same stuff, right? So it doesn't work. That kind of segmenting in that way and just doing the exact same thing, translating it and throwing Latino in front of it, it doesn't work, okay? So Latinos, to me, again, the biggest opportunity in the church, but here's the quandary, we're also leading the exodus from the church. I do think it's important for us to dive into the reasons why this is happening. Now, I don't propose that what I'm about to share with you is in any way comprehensive. There's probably a lot of other reasons. This is just my sense of why Latinos are the biggest opportunity, yet when you look at the stats, we're leaving the church faster than anybody. And I think there's 3 core reasons. One, I've touched on already, which is this deeply embedded sense of cultural Catholicism. It's like we love soccer, we love burritos or sancocho or tacos or empanadas, and we're Catholic, okay? That is good and bad, and the good and bad starts at around age, 8 or 9, where it starts to get bad, okay? So there's a real reality, and you see this in the statistics. If you ask Latino parents, how are you raising your kids? They go Catholic. 93%. But then you look at how they're living their lives, and all the Catholic distinctives drop off radically, right? Do you think it's important that your kids follow the teaching of the faith? 44%. Of the 93 that said they're raising their kids Catholic. Do you think it's important that kids go to Mass regularly? 41%. How about it's important for them to be involved at the parish? a third. So yeah, raising the kids Catholic, but again, an oftentimes very deeply ingrained cultural experience. So that's reason number one, in my opinion, cultural Catholicism. Reason number two, and we're all guilty of this, is an overemphasis on translation as a strategy for engagement. Read engagement any way you like. Ministry, fundraising, accompaniment, whatever, okay? But an overemphasis on translation as that strategy. Now, it is true, okay? It is true that if you ask Latinos, pretty much of all stripes, well, how do you worship? If you're Spanish dominant, meaning I have more of an ability with the Spanish language, like 8 out of 10 of them say the Spanish liturgy. Even if you're bilingual, people like me, even though I don't prefer the Spanish Mass, but people like me, there's a double preference, 2x preference among bilingual, bicultural people to want the Spanish liturgy. Even young people who don't speak Spanish will say they prefer the Spanish language Mass. What? Why? So we asked them, well, why is that? And what we found is that the majority of the reasons they gave us had nothing to do with language, but everything to do with preference, that they sometimes didn't know the prayers in English. I don't know the Our Father. I know it in Spanish. I don't understand what it says, but I know it. So when we're all praying together, I want to say it in Spanish. Or the masses are cooler. There's better music, things like that. It's entirely preferential among that younger set. They don't do it because they have a capability issue. It's not that they can't understand it. It's that they prefer it because it's a cultural thing. So you've got this sort of crazy dynamic that's happening. That led me to recognize that as good as the Spanish is as a tool, right? And I'm sure many of your, if not all of your ministries and apostolates use Spanish in a variety of different ways. It is a tool, and it's a good tool in some respects, but it's also created some major challenges. And we've seen one of the challenges, which is one parish with 2 churches. And there's people who maybe bump into each other in the parking lot. You've seen this, right? You're like pulling up your car, and it's like, oh, how you doing? I don't know who that is, but they're coming by. They're going to the other Mass, the Spanish Mass, which is, we were joking at my tables, usually later in the day. Like, it's the sort of throwaway slot, right? It's like, well, 1 o'clock, we have Mass. Yeah, the Latinos will go to that one. Sure. So we kind of put them in that. So we get this dynamic. And look, this is my personal opinion, and I know it's very controversial. There's a lot of people who don't agree with me, and I fully respect their point of view. But I think this is bad. I think this is really bad, right? Where we have a disintegrated parish experience, disintegrated ministerial experiences, disintegrated diocesan experiences. We did a study once, and I'm not going to name the bishop, but we did a study once, and we asked, like all over the country, we did a big survey, and we asked about the sort of Latino experience in these given dioceses. And we got feedback from certain bishops. It's like, oh yeah, we've got Latinos in our diocese, and we've got the Latino parish. And I was like, the Latino parish? What exactly is that? Because I've been to Mass all over the world, and I don't think I've ever walked in anywhere where it was an understanding that this was the place where whoever went. That doesn't sound right, because it isn't. But nevertheless, that is the reality of how we've chosen to address this. And that's a pastoral approach, but there's the equivalent in the mission advancement world. It's the translation of whatever it is. We need to have a website that has something in Spanish because, people like that. So it's the same kind of thinking, and I think generally it leads to bad outcomes. The third, and this is a big one, is we have an entire generation of people that are growing up and living in what I call the hyphen. I'm a little older than most of these folks, but there's a generation, call it sub-35, that is Hispanic, that is living this hyphen. I got to understand this idea at a moment of insight, a moment of grace in the sacristy right before Mass in Los Angeles. So we have, like I'm sure all your parishes do, we have altar servers. In our parish, every single altar server is Hispanic, every one of them, young, mostly boys, but they're all Latino, every one of them, okay? And I serve the Mass in English and in Spanish. And a lot of times I do them on the same Sunday. So I'll just hang out for the Spanish Mass. And then one time I was getting vested in the sacristy, and I started having a conversation with one of the young altar servers. I was getting vested for the Spanish Mass, okay? In our parish, the Spanish Mass is full to the brim. You can't even get in. The English Mass is like crickets, okay? So I joked with this young kid. I'm like, do you speak Spanish? He's like, no. I said, what are you doing here? He said, well, I'm here because my family's here. I'm like, you should come to the Mass in English. Bring them to the Mass in English because we need more people there, and we need some youth there because there's not a lot of that either. And he looked at me, and this is when it all hit home in a macro way for me. He looked at me, he said, Deacon, nah, man, that's the white Mass. The white Mass. So now, when we're young, we say things inelegantly, okay? So trust me, I don't think he was saying anything about race. But what he was saying was something very deeply cultural. And he was saying, that's not my Mass. That's not where I belong. He doesn't even speak Spanish. He doesn't belong in the other Mass because it's not a reflection of who he is. And that's when the insight hit, because I fast-forwarded in my head. This kid was about 14, 15 years old. And I fast-forwarded to when he was about 18, 19, moves out, and I thought to myself, which of the different liturgical experiences is he more likely to choose when he's choosing on his own? The Mass that he understands everything in but feels no connection to, or the Mass where he's connected culturally but doesn't understand what's being said? Which of those is he going to choose of living in that hyphen? And the answer, statistically, is neither. Neither. And that's what's giving birth to the unaffiliated phenomenon that we're seeing, which is principally driven by the Latino population. The other insight that hit me at that moment is that the parish is not a building, nor is it a Mass time. The parish, let us remember, is a canonical region. It's actually like got lines around it. If you find these maps, everybody in the parish, whatever they are, wherever they are, housed, unhoused, doesn't matter. Christian, unchristian, that's your parish. That's the people that we should be serving. And I know that in mission advancement, the parish life is not necessarily always something we consider, but it's a great model to look at for understanding what the opportunity really is. So those are 3 reasons that I think this is all happening. All right. So what does this mean for you? What does this all mean for you? Well, if you happen to be Latino, the 4 or 5 or 6 different people that raised their hand earlier when I asked the question, my bishop, Archbishop Jose Gomez, calls us, Latinos in the U.S., the spiritual heirs of St. Juan Diego. That's a pretty big deal. The spiritual heirs of St. Juan Diego. Do you know, in 10 years, an entire continent was converted to Christianity because of Our Lady of Guadalupe and the mission and the ministry of the people who were there on the ground in Mexico? That mission continues in the Americas here. And so if you're Latino, this is your mission, and you have to recognize that calling. And it means you have to get involved. You have to get involved, and you have to integrate both at the parish and also throughout the rest of the Catholic world. I joked earlier, but if we are 40% of the church, then there should have been 60 hands going up in this room when I asked that question, and they're not. Is that your fault? No, not entirely. Is that their fault? No, not entirely. But we each kind of share the blame a little bit. We got to invite more of those folks in, and they've got to choose for themselves. It's like, hey, I can't just be a wallflower and sit back. I got to get involved. I got to live my mission. Okay? So that's what if you're Latino. Now, if you're non-Latino, there's a number of things that I recommend. And again, this is not comprehensive. But probably chief among them is this is an intentional thing. And we are, as Christians, people of intention, right? At least we should be. And we've got to change our watering holes. We got to enter into relationship with these communities in a real way. It takes effort. I wish I could tell you it was easy. It's not. It takes effort and intention. What does changing your watering hole mean? Well, it means something different for each of you. If you generally bring interns from a particular university or a particular place, Change your watering hole, maybe once, maybe twice. Bring somebody who maybe has this lived experience into your apostolate. If you tend to partner with company X to do your marketing, maybe change your watering hole and get a different perspective. So this idea of changing our watering holes, I think, is a big deal for everybody who's not Latino. Number two, recognize, as necessary as translation is, it is not a strategy. If you think it is, I'm sorry to tell you, you're mistaken. You're going to get people who say, thank you for putting whatever it was in Spanish, and a whole lot of people who, frankly, it is meaningless too. And you're going to see that reflected in your metrics. You know how many rooms I've been in where people tell me, oh, we tried that. I had a big Catholic publisher tell me, we published a book in Spanish and nobody bought it. Nobody. So, do Latinos like to read? Serious question. I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure they do. What did you publish? Oh, it was a theological treatise on Dietrich Bonhoeffer or something like, Well, just out of curiosity, what gave you the idea that that was a book that the Latino population in the U.S. needed? Crickets. Okay, so your metrics will reflect the fact that this is true, but we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's not that the Latinos don't care or that they're not there. It's that we've got to pick a strategy that isn't translation. Third, voice over language. I say this everywhere I speak, even if I'm not talking about Latino stuff. What you're hearing right now from this podium is 100% Latino voice, 100%. But it's in English because voice matters more than language. So recognize that in bringing forward cultural things or people and faces that represent these communities and in different ways. And then lastly, inside like the outside. Again, I brought up the example of this room. This is not about, the sort of secular political version of representation, because to me, in a lot of cases, that ends up really being balkanization, right? Putting people in their little respective areas. The black people go over here, the Latinos go over here. That's not Catholic either. But what this means is that we should have our sheep among us. And again, our sheep are what I showed you in the previous slide. Now, specifically for mission advancement, so I'm kind of getting ready to wrap up here. Everybody here needs to know the Latino demographic story, both for the U.S. and for the church. And guess what? Your donors should know too. They should know. That's what the church is today. You should make every effort to source bilingual and bicultural talent into your organizations. Again, do it intentionally. It makes a big deal. It makes a big difference. And then lastly, design Latino-specific initiatives, vehicles, or funds. What are they? Your mileage will vary depending on what area of the vineyard you occupy. But I can bet you we could spend a cup of coffee and brainstorm on some things that would be specifically designed, tailored to your ministry or your apostolate, that impact this particular community that could be meaningful for a Latino donor. I mean, I'm on like a bunch of boards in the Catholic world, and my wife and I give money anonymously to a lot of places. I've never had anybody, really, besides Rosie, bring me something that is specifically designed for the Latino community. If more people did, that might involve me in more apostolates. Okay? Some practical insights then to close. When we say Latino, it's important to de-average, not average. We get translation when we average, okay? Again, back to intention. This is an exercise of intentionality. When we say Latino, what do we mean? Do we mean really young people because we have a teen-based apostolate? Then Spanish is probably almost never going to factor into the equation. When we say Latino, do we mean because we've got, a ministry or an apostolate for recent immigrants? Do we need that? Well, then the approach and the language and the strategy is going to be based on that. So we have to de-average, not average, and really ask ourselves the follow-up question. And frankly, in everything that you do, in whatever process you have, before you greenlight something, ask yourself that question. How does this work for the Latino community that Deacon Charlie talked about? If you get a lot of people in the room going, I don't know, then stay there for a minute. You're not ready to greenlight. You're not ready to go forward. Just ask yourself that procedural question. That can actually help a great deal. And then the other thing is, look, we're Catholic. It's relational. It's not transactional. right? It's relational. It's not transactional. You got to get your hands dirty. You got to go into those different places where you haven't been before and talk to voices you haven't heard from before, right? Easy way, just go to the mass in your diocese that has the Spanish mass. It'll be later in the day, so you have lunch first, then you could go. But try it once. They're all, everybody there speaks English, just maybe not a lot, so you could talk to them afterwards. But experience these things. Get in there, right? Like Pope Francis says, hacer lío, right? Make a mess. Get in, get messy. So those are some insights. Lastly, a couple of best practices based on asking ourselves the question of what do we mean by Latino? If we're talking about less acculturated folks, right? Maybe they're more recent immigrants. They tend to be older. We're going to lead with Spanish. We're going to also key on their specific needs because we know them. One of them, I will give you, based on the dynamics that I described earlier, is that they are banging their heads up against the wall figuring out how to get their kids to stay Catholic. Because they talk to them in Spanish, and there's this weird divide. There's like this weird thing. I lived it. Where if I was having an issue in my high school, I could never come to my mom and talk to her about it. She lived in some other planet with some other thing. I had to talk to her in a different language. Okay, I talked to my friends about that, and my friends gave me terrible advice. Okay, so we have to key on their needs. That's an important one. And I'm sure that the bright minds behind all the apostolates in the room could figure out at least a way to potentially solve that one. Third thing, very multi-generational reality. The Latino population, especially in this less acculturated world, has tias and abuelas, aunts and uncles and grandparents all living together. It's a very multi-generational reality. So how can our efforts adapt, shift? How can our communication shift and adapt to reflect that? For the more acculturated, you got to go culture first. And I'm going to show you just lastly 2 quick examples of what I mean by that. You got to be culture forward. In English, culture forward. You also have to lean on digital means to communicate. This population, the more acculturated Latino population, is an entire generation younger than the average American. So digital things predominate. Digital means to communicate, also digital tools that can be developed to reach. They make great fundraising vehicles. We've got a great new app that we're starting. We need $500,000 to pull it off. And then lastly, a really easy one, but I almost never see it, is reflect them in the stuff that you do out in the world. Like if you put a brochure together, if you put, a website together, it should look like the church does, especially the younger church. Like it should look like them. So do that. It's not going to hurt. It's not like people who see it who aren't Latino are going to go, wait, that's not for me. It just reflects the world they see every day going to the supermarket. But it means a lot to people like me who would look at these things and go, what is this? It sounds cool, but I don't know if it's for me. So that's a real easy way to do it. Okay, finally, 2 examples of some folks. And this is just, there's a lot of people doing really great things, but I want to just point out 2 who are getting that more acculturated use case really solidly done in the Catholic space. One is my friend Father Agustino Torres from the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal. He's amazing. If you ever want to know inculturated done right, just go onto YouTube and search for any of his talks in any of the youth group things that he does out in LA. The whole thing's in English, but those young people respond to him in a way that I've never seen because he's very culture first. He knows their walk, and he communicates that way. Corazón Puro is his apostolate, literally taken directly from their website, born and bred in the Bronx, okay? This entire apostolate was inspired by a Dominican mom who approached Father Agustino and said, please help me to make sure that my daughters are growing up with chastity in the forefront. And so it was born out of that. What do? They awaken and accompany Latino leaders in areas of great need, and they're helping to form the future of the church. This is the only that I know of, there may be others, but the only one that I know of, inculturated teen formation program in the church today. That is a program for confirmation and faith formation that is all in English, but is designed with the heart of what those young people are. And it's amazing. He also has a great podcast. I don't know if Jason Nees is still here from OSV, but he was here yesterday. OSV signed up Father Agustino and his apostolate to create a podcast, which is also a really great example of this kind of enculturated approach done well. And then the last one is my friend Alejandra, who's from San Antonio, I guess where we're going to have our conference next year. Maybe we can invite her to talk. That'd be kind of cool. She runs an apostolate called Bendecida 15, and she got this crazy idea that the quinceañera, the sort of sweet 16 in the Latino population, would be a heck of a platform for evangelization. It's kind of a throwaway thing. A lot of priests don't even like it, and for good reason, by the way, for good reason, because in some ways it's sort of a cheapened liturgy or some kind of promotional thing, but it can be done beautifully, and it's a very important moment in the Latino culture, and it's a moment where the young person is actually involved, and where people from all the generations come, many of which haven't stepped foot in a church in a long while. So she built this platform that basically helps prep families and ministers, and also a lot of faith-centered quinceañera products. So just a couple of very quick examples of folks who I think are out there doing at least that more acculturated model really well. There are more, and there's more on this subject, but I really do pray, and I forgot to pray at the beginning. Shame on me, I should have, because I thought about it, but I really do pray that something from this talk has been helpful to you in your apostolates and in your ministries, and I really do give thanks from my heart that you guys are out there, that you're doing what you're doing, because we really need it. So